Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So, welcome to this evening's program.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So, can I start with a welcome and then?
Yes.
Inshallah. So, welcome to this evening's program, and thank you all for coming. And Jazakallah khair, Brother Muhammad has asked that I introduce myself. My name is Abdullah Al-Ansari, and I'm currently living and working in Columbia, South Carolina, and I am the Senior Muslim Chaplain for the South Carolina Department of Corrections. And I am here as your visitor, as your guest, to deliver a lecture, a brief talk that I hope will turn into a dialogue under the topic Islam between Reform and Conform. So let me begin by saying that, brothers and sisters, we live in a modern era, and there is incredible momentum and powerful forces driving us toward modernization and modernity, telling us we need to get with the times and embrace wholesale changes, abandon tradition and all things traditional. And that obviously includes things like rural, agrarian social structures, outdated political systems, long-standing social norms and moral standards, old technologies, antiquated systems, conventional approaches to medicine and the treatments of disease and illness, etc. The basic premise of the modernity movement is that one's predecessors, even one's immediate predecessors, should be viewed as archaic and everything associated with them as obsolete. Now, these calls for modernization have also come to encompass religion and people of various faiths. People of various faiths have been pressured to reform their respective faiths and make them more modern. And Islam and Muslims are no exception. In fact, it could be argued that no faith has been pressured more vigorously than the Islamic faith. And no faith group has been pressured more intensely than the Muslims to modernize and commit to reform. And this, brothers and sisters, is in large part due to the fact that modern views and applications of religion are far less conservative and committed to tradition than even the most liberal Islamic views, making Islam and Muslims as a whole seem exceptionally backward and out of touch. Things like rejecting the theory of human evolution, commitment to observe the 5 daily prayers in the same manner prescribed over 1400 years ago, dry fasting, the prohibition of the consumption of alcohol, the banning of homosexual activity, opposition to gay marriage, and so on, are among the Islamic views and practices which make it seem to many, even to some Muslims, that Islam is stuck in the dark ages and in desperate need of reform. Brothers and sisters, our religion is a religion that commands us to think in a manner guided by our teachings and principles. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, throughout the Quran, He tells us to think, tells us to reflect, tells us to use our brains and to make educated, calculated decisions, not emotional ones, and to never allow ourselves to be led around by our noses by others or to follow others blindly. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and what I want to do, brothers and sisters, is we talked about our religion being a religion of thinking, and we're supposed to think. So what I thought we would do is we would give ourselves something to think about. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm not going to tell you what to think. What we're going to do here tonight is give ourselves something to think about. And as I said, our religion teaches us to think in light of our teachings and principles, to be guided in our thinking by our teachings and principles. So let's contemplate some of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that speak to this topic. And let's really contemplate about the meanings and implications of some of those words. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَهُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً ولكن ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم فاستبقوا الخيرات إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is from Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 48. And we're actually going to read to 50 and just contemplate. But that's the first verse, number 48. What does Allah say in these words? He says, we have revealed to you, O Prophet, this book with truth. What's the implication of that? Allah revealed to us this book, the Quran, with truth. What's the implication of that? That what is in the Quran is absolutely true. وَمَا عَدَاهُ, and whatever is besides it is falsehood. Whatever contradicts it, مَا يُصَادِمُهُ وَيُعَارِضُهُ, is what? Is false. فَمَاذَا بَعْدَ الْحَقِّ إِلَّا الضَّلَالَ. What is there after truth except falsehood? Then he says, as a confirmation of previous scriptures and a supreme authority over them. What does that mean? Supreme authority over them. وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. It means, first of all, it further confirms or affirms what he just said. Bil-haq, it's the truth, right? And therefore it should rightfully supersede everything that precedes it. That's false. And also, it lets the Muslims know that they are in no need of seeking knowledge of faith and what they should do religiously and spiritually from what? From others. Why? Because what they have supersedes whatever they might have, whatever we might think they have of good. To the point that the Prophet ﷺ in the famous hadith, he saw Umar al-Khattab reading some pages of the Torah. And he said, "Amutahawwik ya Umar." He said, do you have some doubt? Do you have some reservations about Islam? He said, no, I just want to, increase my knowledge. He said, so the Prophet ﷺ said that I have brought you the truth. I brought you this Islam, bayda, naqi. I brought you what? It's pure, pristine. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no defects in it. And if Moses were alive today, he would have to follow me. But then Allah, He goes on, He says, so judge between them by what Allah has revealed and do not follow their desires, giving them precedence over the truth that has come to you. What's the message there? The message is, make what Allah has given you, the Quran and the Hadith, make it the criteria by which you judge and distinguish truth from falsehood. Every time somebody comes to you and says, hey, you should do this, you should do that, hold what they say up to the light of the Quran and Hadith. And if it's inconsistent with that, you do what? You dismiss it. Then he goes on and he says, if Allah had willed, He would have made you all one community, all thinking the same thing, doing the same things, believing the same things, behaving in the same way. But His will is to test you with what He has given each of you. We are tested by Allah with our Sharia, with our law, with our teachings, with our Quran. Will we follow it or will we abandon it? At the first sign of difficulty, the first sign of being challenged, will we just what? Forsake it. Then He says, to Allah will you all return. Then He will inform you of the truth regarding your differences. Then he goes on and he says, وَإِنْحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَنْ يَفْتِنُوكَ عَنْ بَعْضِ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَإِنْ يَتَوَلَّوْا فَإِنْ تَوَلَّوْا فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهُ يُرِيدُ أَنْ يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِمْ وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ النَّاسِ لَفَاسِقُونَ. He says, and judge between them, O Prophet, by what Allah has revealed, and not follow their desires, وَاحْذَرْهُمْ, and beware. Ikhwan, if somebody tells you, beware, beware. Do you think that whatever they're telling you to be aware of is something good for you or something that will harm you? Everybody in agreement? You don't say beware of something which is good. Beware, there's $1 million around the corner. Do we do that? No, we don't do that. Right? We go, get out of the way, there's $1 million around the corner. So if he says beware, means there's something dangerous, potentially dangerous at hand. What is that dangerous thing? He says, so they do not lure you away from what Allah has revealed to you. Meaning, that when people come to us and question our religion, or tell us to question our religion, or tell us to change our religion, or reform our religion, or to modernize, whatever they're telling us, what they might be saying might be good for us. It might be bad for us. But if there's a possibility that it could lure us away from our religion, they're talking about our religion, automatically we have to be on what? On guard. Be aware that they might lure you away from some of what Allah has revealed to you, because that's a bad thing. You might not realize how bad it is, but it's bad. Why? Because Allah says, beware. Then he says, and if they turn away from Allah's judgment, then know that it is Allah's will to repay them for some of their sins, and that many people are indeed rebellious. Then he says, أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا لِقَوْمٍ يُوقِنُونَ. He says, is it the judgment of the period of ignorance prior to revelation that they prefer? And this is important because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us that, do you like to go back to the time before revelation, when people did not follow Allah's rulings, they didn't follow His guidance, they followed nothing but what? Their desires. This is very important, and you're going to see why it's important at the end when we start asking some more critical questions. But think closely, contemplate what Allah is saying. أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ. Do you want to go back to the time where people turned their back on revelation? There was no revelation, and people had no choice but to do what? To just follow their desires. And everything was relative. Truth was relative. Do you want to go back to that time? Then he says, وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا لِقَوْمٍ يُوقِنُونَ. Who could be better of a judge than Allah for the people of certain faith? When you have the judgment of Allah, Jalla Jalaluhu wa Azuma Sultan, what could be better for you? Is your own judgment or the judgment of other humans better than the judgment of Allah? That's basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. So now we've set the stage, got our minds calibrated, and now we're ready to think. Thinking, brothers and sisters, being independent-minded, and maintaining our religious integrity necessitates that we ask certain critical questions. And we strive to reconcile between calls for reform with the religious mandate to conform. We have to what? Reconcile between those. How do we do that? We ask certain critical questions. What are those questions? We'll start out with some, we'll close with others. Again, the whole purpose is for us to what? To think. To encourage us to think, not to tell us what to think. What are some of these questions? What is intended by reform? We have to ask that. Somebody says the Muslims need to reform. They need to get with the program. They need to modernize. That's fine. We can accept that, but we have to follow up with a question. Well, what do you mean by that? Because the word reform can mean different things to different people. Is that not so? Yes. Right? So we have to ask, well, what exactly do you mean by that? Because there might be a meaning that you intend by it that we can accept. And there might be a meaning that we have to reject. Tayyib, is reform synonymous with a tajdeed? And is that what the callers for reform intend by it? Are they synonyms? And is that what the callers of reform, when they say, hey, you need to reform, do they mean you need to jadjidu? You need to renew, revive? You need to rejuvenate? Is that what they mean? Another question. From where do these calls for reform originate? Another question. What is truly motivating these calls? Another question. What is the basic premise of these calls? And is that an acceptable premise? Another question. What does our religion say about that premise? Now, last question of the first series of questions. How does our religion guide us to respond to these calls in light of the answers to these questions? How does our religion tell us? Because Allah says what? That we have to be guided by our religion. We have to hold everything up to the light of our religion. What does our faith say? And then act accordingly. The first question was, what is intended by reform? Reform, brothers and sisters, is generally defined as making changes in something in order to improve it. The operative words are change and improve. Common synonyms include to make better, to refine, to correct. So when people speak of religious reform, they are in essence speaking of making changes to establish religious norms, refining what they deem unrefined, and correcting perceived errors in religion. Let me say that again. Correcting perceived errors in religion. When people talk about reform, they're talking about correcting errors. Now we have to ask ourselves more critical questions. Before we ask those questions, so basically what we conclude is that the one who embarks on this undertaking, the undertaking of reform, and calls for it, either they embrace the idea that there is something wrong with religion, or at least there's room for improvement, or at least he or she wishes to modernize religion for the sake of what? Modernity. Just for modernity's sake. Everything else is being modernized. Religion should do that too, or should get with the program. That should lead us to more questions. Like, is our religion fundamentally flawed? You don't have to answer that outside. Answer that inside yourself. Do you as a Muslim feel comfortable saying, my religion is fundamentally flawed? Do you feel comfortable with that? Because go back to what we said, reform, the operative words are correct, improve. So if you want to reform your religion, it means that you have to believe that it's fundamentally what? Flawed. There's a need for correction. Can we as Muslims view our religion as such? Is it acceptable? Meaning, is it acceptable Islamically if a Muslim said, my religion is fundamentally flawed, would that affect his Islam? Would that make him less of a Muslim? We have to ask ourselves that question. Also, if we do, how does that reflect upon Allah? If a Muslim said, yeah, Islam is not perfect, Islam has flaws, then what does that say about Allah? What does that say about His messenger? We have to think about the implications of what we believe. What does it say about Allah? What does it say about His messenger? And what does it say about what? About us. I'm following a religion which is flawed. Ask yourself these questions, and can you accept that? Also, and remember we said, our thinking should always be guided by the teachings and principles of our faith. So you have to answer those questions guided by the statement of Allah in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 3, Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakum Islam Madina. He says, this day I have perfected your religion for you, completed my favor upon you, and I am pleased. Allah is pleased with Islam as it was on that day as our religion. So, if I say it's flawed, the implication is I'm displeased. Allah is pleased. I'm displeased. I'm out of phase with Allah. But I'm a believer in Allah. I'm a Muslim submitting to Allah. Yeah, a lot of questions we have to answer. You guys see that? But think about that. We ask the question, is reform synonymous with a tajdeed? And is that what the callers for reform intend by it? In the hadith collected by Abu Dawood from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Inna Allah Azza wa Jal yab'athu li hadhihi al-ummah ala ra'si kulli miyati sana man yujaddidu laha dinaha. He said, surely Allah, mighty and exalted, will appoint for this community of believers at the beginning of each century one who will renew or revive their religion for them. The Prophet said that. This term, or the term used in this hadith, is yujaddid, from the word at-tajdeed, mushtaq min at-tajdeed, which literally means to renew, to revive, to restore, to rejuvenate, to regenerate. All of these meanings imply that the object of the process of a tajdeed, the object of that process, the one that we're trying to what? To renew or to revive, that thing that we're trying to renew or revive has been neglected, has been abandoned, forsaken, or allowed to perish. And the one carrying out the process, al-mujaddid, the renewer, the reviver, seeks to restore it, bring it back to prominence, and return it to life. Not to change it, but to bring it back and reinstate it the way it was. The way it was. Quick question. Reform and tajdeed. Based upon what we've studied so far, are they the same? They sure don't sound like they're the same thing. Is this what the callers for reform mean when they call for reform? Not apparently. Listen to what one of them said recently, and I quote. He said, does medieval Islamic law prescribe the death penalty for extramarital sex? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But was this the norm, or was it a type of scare tactic so that people don't actually commit adultery? Should these laws, and pay attention, should these laws be updated and modernized? Again, that's an ongoing discussion, and that is one of the main sources of intra-Muslim dialogue. You know, I'm sure that many Jews and many Christians understand this. The texts say things that are somewhat problematic at times. The texts have some laws which are somewhat bizarre. So Muslims do need to have this dialogue. I want to highlight a few words in that quote. Number one, updated and modernized. Number two, somewhat problematic. Number three, bizarre. I want to ask you, remember what we talked about, the difference between reform and a tajdeed in terms of meaning and application. A tajdeed, just to go back to that one, a tajdeed would be reviving and rejuvenating something which was not practiced. For example, there's a sunnah that a person, when they're about to eat, they're supposed to divide their stomach into three parts. A part in which they fill with food, a part that they fill with their drink, and a part that they leave empty for easy breathing. Most of us don't practice that sunnah. That is an abandoned sunnah. So if a person were to call to this and preach to this and encourage people to practice it, he'll be doing what? He'll be practicing a tajdeed, reviving it. But we talked about reform being what? Changing something. And that changing necessitates that you consider that thing to be flawed and in need of improvement. So now look at the words of the reformers. And we gave some of them. Are these phrases and words, update, modernize, problematic, bizarre, do they imply that we seek to restore? Did those words imply to you restore? Is there anyone here who hears those words and say, yeah, this person wants to bring these things back? No, you don't. They imply that the person wants to change them because he views them as what? As wrong. Listen to the words describing something from Allah's religion as bizarre, as problematic. But another question we asked, from where do these calls to reform originate? We have to ask this question. Yes, there are some Muslim callers for reform. But in reality, their calls are inspired by the calls of the non-Muslims. They're influenced by the non-Muslims. And we know this because those Muslim reformers, they don't support their calls with Islamic texts. They don't say, I want to change the religion because Allah said, or because the messenger said. They don't support their calls for reform with our teachings. So for example, there are some callers who say we need to reform the way we, as Muslims, look at the LGBTQ community. There are people who say this. And they have views which they consider to be more modern, more up-to-date, reformed views on that community. But they don't support these views. They won't say, yeah, we should view the LGBT community in this way because Allah said, because His messenger said. In fact, they don't support them with the text, but rather they support their opinions or their views with arguments aimed at delegitimizing the texts, telling us why we shouldn't follow these texts anymore. We should just ignore them. Is that reform? Or is that change and improve? I'm sorry, is that reform, change and improve? Or is it a tajdeed, to revive, to rejuvenate, to bring back? Yeah, we have to ask ourselves. What is truly motivating these calls? These calls for reform. Muslims need to reform. Muslims need to get with the program. Muslims need to change things. Muslims need to do away with certain things. Muslims need to adopt different beliefs. These calls for reform, what is motivating these calls? We can speculate, but rather than speculate, let's say what Allah says. Let's read some of the verses from Allah's book that tell us what could possibly be some of the motivations. He says, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, the 2nd chapter, verse number 109, He says, وَدَّ كَثِيرٌ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ لَوْ يُرُدُّونَكُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ إِيمَانِكُمْ كُفَّارًا حَسَدًا مِنْ عِنْدِ أَنفُسِهِمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الْحَقُّ فَاعْفُوا وَاصْفَحُوا حَتَّى يَأْتِيَ اللَّهُ بِأَمْرِهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. He says, many among the people of the book wish that they could turn you believers back to disbelief because of their envy after the truth has been made clear to them. Pardon and bear with them until Allah delivers His decision. Surely Allah is most capable of everything. Allah also says, وَلَن تَرْضَ عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ وَلَن اتَّبَعْتَ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ بَعْدَ الَّذِي جَاءَكَ مِنْ الْحَقِّ جَاءَكَ مِنْ الْعِلْمِ مَا لَكَ مِنْ اللَّهِ مِنْ وَلِيٍّ وَلَا نَصِيرٍ. He says, never will the Jews or Christians be pleased with you until you follow their faith. Say, Allah's guidance is the only true guidance. And if you were to follow their desires, after all the knowledge that has come to you, there will be none to protect or help you against Allah. He also says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَدُّوا لَوْ تَكْفُرُونَ كَمَا كَفَرُوا فَتَكُونُونَ سَوَاءً فَلَا تَتَّخِذُوا مِنْهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءَ حَتَّى يُهَاجِرُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. He says, they wish you would disbelieve as they have disbelieved, so you may be alike, so that you may all be alike. So do not take them as allies unless they show that they're really committed to faith by immigrating in the way of Allah, right? And finally, I want you to remember, brothers and sisters, that our beloved Prophet ﷺ, he lived in a time that resembled our time in a certain way. And that is, we live in a time where Islam and the Muslims are public enemy number one. We're the target. We're the focus. We're the last bastion of true one, of true faith and commitment to faith traditionally, or in traditional sense. And the Prophet ﷺ lived in a time where Islam and Muslims were also public enemy number one. They were the greatest threat to the empire of Quraysh, the empire of paganism and idolatry. And the people of paganism, threatened as they were by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his pure message of Islam, they came to him to strike a bargain. They told him, incline toward us, we'll incline toward you. Worship our gods for a certain period of time, we'll worship your God for a certain period of time. Worship ours for a year, we'll worship yours for a year. They told the Prophet to what? To make tweaks, right? Come with a different Quran, or badil. Come with a different Quran, or what? Make some changes in it. Reform it. The Prophet wanted to get along with them. He wanted to make it work, but he wasn't willing to compromise his religion, so Allah told him what to respond. He told him, say, Ya ayyuhal kafirun, la a'budu ma ta'budun, wa antum a'biduna ma a'bud, lakum dinukum waliya din. He told them, say, O Muhammad, O you disbelievers, I don't worship what you worship, and you don't worship what I worship. To you your way, and to me mine. We're different. And I'm comfortable with that, he said. He was told to say. And the believers who follow him were told to say similarly. Yeah, if in your religion, if in Christianity, which if you go back 200 years ago would never accept certain things that they've accepted today. If in your religion you can now what? Fundamentally change your religion, and what people considered haram 200 years ago is now halal. It's the best thing to do. The virtues of 200 years ago are now vices, and the vices of 200 years ago are now virtues. If that works for you, lakum dinukum waliya din. Just because you do that doesn't mean we have to. We have to do that. These verses, brothers and sisters, they provide a clear indication of what motivates the non-Muslims. As for the motives of some Muslims, again, we can only speculate, but I'll give a few of them that are possible. Products of the environment. We live in an environment where we're always encouraged to change from generation to generation, to the point that every new generation has its own what? Its own name, and part of that labeling of the generations is basically to motivate them, to push them to be different, to make wholesale changes, and to consider the generation just before them as what? As outdated, obsolete, antiquated, wrong. Right? Blaze your own trail. Generation Z, Generation X, Generation Y, the millennials, they keep giving these different labels basically to tell them you have to be different. And everything that was before is wrong. We're products of that environment. We're living in that environment, and we're products of it. Also succumbing to the pressure from others. We're pressured to get along, to get with the program. Being enamored by non-Muslims and feeling that we should follow their lead. We see the reformist movements in Judaism and Christianity, and we think, what? They blaze the trail, we should follow their trail. Also, following the masses. Everybody's doing it, so we should do it too. Although Allah says, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَن فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَن سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. If you obey most of the people, if you do what everybody's doing, they'll take you away from the path of Allah. And also a possibility is that we actually believe that the religion is flawed and requires improvement. It's antiquated and requires updating. We actually believe that. Some Muslims have allowed themselves to believe that. And we saw an example of that. It needs to be updated, needs to be modernized, somewhat problematic, bizarre. Some people actually believe these things. Unfortunately. What's the basic premise? Basic premise is everything that is old is wrong. Anything old, by virtue of being old, is erroneous, is bad, and needs to be replaced and updated. But it's important for us as thinking Muslims to ask ourselves, is this premise accurate? Is it absolutely true? Is it even reasonable? Every time something gets old, it's bad. There's no usefulness to it. There's no utility to it. Tell that to somebody who likes food cooked in a tandoor. Right? You can't make that food any other way. If you do, if you put it in a regular oven or you put it on a grill outside, it won't taste the same way it tastes if it's done in what? In a tandoor. Am I right or no? It won't. That's why for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, they're still cooking those dishes in the same way they did thousands of years ago, because that's the only way you can get that what? That taste. And this old thing will never be outdated so long as that taste is desired and sought after. And we can give other examples of this, that there are things that are old that are better than what's new. They'll never be replaced by what's new. What does our religion say about this premise? Everything old should be replaced. Everything old should be abandoned. I'll give a few examples because, again, we wanted to give time for discussion. What time is Salat al-Isha? 9 o'clock. Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, so we're going to close. We're going to give a few and we'll close. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنكُمْ فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ إِن كُنتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ وَأَحْسَنُ تَأْوِيلًا. O believers, obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those in authority among you. should you disagree on anything? Should we change? Can we change? You disagree? Take it back to Allah and His Messenger. If you truly believe in Allah and the last day, that is best and fairest for resolution. That's the best way to come to the right conclusion. Allah says also, He says, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِي مَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا مِمَّا قَضَيْتَ وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. He says, but know by your Lord, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they will never truly believe, they will never have true faith until they accept you, O Prophet, as the judge in their disputes and find no resistance within themselves against your decision and submit wholeheartedly. And He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَن يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولِ من بعد ما تبين له الهدى ويتبع غير سبيل المؤمنين نوله ما تولى ونصله جهنم وساءت مصيرا. He says, and whoever defies the messenger after guidance has become clear to them and follows a path other than the believers, we will let him pursue what he has chosen, burn him in hell. What an evil end. He also says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا لِمُؤْمِنَةٍ وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا إن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم ومن يعص الله ورسوله فقد ضل ضلالا مبينا. Says it's not for believing man or believing woman when Allah and His Messenger have decreed a matter to have any choice or feel at liberty to what? To forsake their decision and do what they think is best. Whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger has clearly gone astray. The Prophet said in the famous hadith of Aisha, he said, "Man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fahuwa rad." He said, whoever introduces into this matter of ours that which is not from it. Take something that wasn't from the deen and introduces it into the deen and makes it a part of the deen. Changes the deen. That change, that reform will be what? Will be rejected. And just to show you how far it goes when it comes to faith, and again, we're not talking about technology. Not talking about the cars we drive, the clothes we wear. Not talking about the designs and construction of our houses and buildings and mosques. Not talking about technological advancements and accepting those reforms. We're talking about reforming religion, changing the deen. Just to show you how far the Prophet ﷺ used to push back, how hard he would push back against any type of what? Altering. Once he taught Al-Bara ibn Azib, one of his companions, radiallahu anhu, he taught him a dua. Taught him what to say before going to what? To sleep. Told him when you go to your bed, he said, lie down on your right side, cup your cheek in your right hand, and say, Allahumma inni wajjahtu wajhi ilayk, wa alja'tu dhahri ilayk, wa fawwadtu amri ilayk, raghbatan wa rahbatan ilayk, la manja wa la manja minka illa ilayk, amantu bi kitabika alladhi anzalta wa bi nabiyyika alladhi arsalta. So he taught him this dua, and at the end of it, he told him to say, I believe in the book that you revealed and the prophet you sent. So Al-Bara, like many of us, if the Prophet taught us something, would start doing what? Started repeating it so he wouldn't forget it. And so as he's rehearsing it, he got to the end and he said, Amantu bi kitabika alladhi anzalta wa bi rasulika alladhi arsalta. He said, I believe in the book that you revealed, and I believe in the messenger you sent. Did the Prophet teach him messenger or prophet? He taught him prophet, not messenger. So when he heard Al-Bara repeating it and changing it from just one word, that can also be can kind of be a synonym, and either word is definitely applicable to the messenger. Is that not so? Isn't our prophet a prophet and a messenger? So did Al-Bara say anything wrong? He didn't say anything wrong, but he didn't say what the Prophet told him. He changed it. And the Prophet said, la. He said, no, don't say Rasulik, say Nabiyik. Say it the way I taught you to this degree, to this extent. But I say all that to say, because again, we're talking about being thinking Muslims, before we embrace this concept of reform, we should ask and be able to convincingly answer a few more questions. Somebody comes and says, we need to reform. We need to get with the program. We need to embrace modernity and faith. We're open to the discussion, but we have to ask certain questions. Whose idea of reform should we follow? Because reform means different things to different people. So we have 100 people, we line them up, and we ask them, what does reform mean? And all of them give us different meanings. Which one do we choose? and why? Why this one and not this one or that one? Number two, who determines where and when reform is needed? What reform should be made? Who's going to make that call? Do we need to reform the hudud? Some people say yes, some people say no. Who's going to make the call whether we do or don't? Do we need to reform our views of the LGBTQ community? Do we need to reform those views? Who's going to make that call? Like, what lines can be crossed? What lines can't be crossed? What changes can't be made? Who's going to make that call? We need to change the salat. 5 times is a lot. How about 3? Some people say, no, we can't change it. It has to be 5. Who's going to make that call that this line, the line of salat, it can't be crossed or it can be crossed? Who's going to make that call? How much reform is enough? When do we stop? Do we stop when there's nothing from the deen left? Brothers and sisters, the Christians and Jews, when they started their reformist movements, which are still ongoing, I'm sure the people who first thought of the idea of reform, they are turning over in their graves, knowing how far reform has gotten. These were people who used to pray at one time. Pray similar to the way we prayed. You know that in the scriptures it says that Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane and fell on his face and prayed. He made sujood. This was not something foreign to them. This was part of their faith at one time. That doesn't exist in their faith now. You go into their churches, their places of worship, there's no place to make sujood. It's all what? Pews. Their rituals were not music and singing and guitars and organs, but they are now. Their religion was a religion of Tawheed. When Jesus is asked on the day of judgment, did you tell them to worship you and your mother? He will say, مَا قُلْتُ لَهُمْ إِلَّا مَا أَمَرْتَنِي بِهِ أَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ رَبِّي وَرَبَّكُمْ. He said, I didn't say anything to them except what you told me to say. Worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. They were people of Tawheed. Where are they from Tawheed today? Once you open that door, the next question, once we open that door, how will it be closed? What is to stop one nation, one generation of reformers to undo everything done by the previous generation, the next one, to the point we go from a deen where today, 1400 years after the Prophet, no, we're not the greatest. Maybe he wouldn't be totally proud, but you know what would make him proud if he were here today? We still pray. We still believe in the oneness of Allah. We don't have pews in our masajid. We're not singing and holding hands instead of saying Al-Fatiha. That would make the Prophet proud. But once that door of reform is open, brothers and sisters, there's no certainty. There's no way you can guarantee that we won't be the people of pews and singing and no prayer. Last but not least, we have to learn from the example of those who came before us, and we mentioned their example. You have to look and see, what did reform do for them? Did it really make them better? Or did it make them worse? You have to really ask yourself that question. And in closing, remember the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, لَتَتَّبِعَنَّ سَنَّ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ حَذْوَ الْقُدَّةِ بِالْقُدَّةِ. He said, you will follow the footsteps of the people who came before you, just like the tail of an arrow follows its point. حَتَّى لَوْ دَخَلُوا جُحْرَ ضَبٍّ لَدَخَلْتُمُوهُ. To the point that even if they entered into the hole of a lizard and got stuck therein, you would rush to go behind them. You see the dilemma, the predicament that what they did put them in, and that won't daunt you. That won't stop you from going right behind them. You see, where are they now? Where are they now? There's no going back. They can't turn back. They can't say, you know what, we have to believe in the oneness of Allah. They can't do that. They can't say, you know, we have to stop singing so much and pray more. And when we pray, we have to pray to Allah, Jalla Jalaluhu, Azama Sultanu, and not Jesus. They can't go back. There's no going back. And so these are the questions, the critical questions we have to ask ourselves. And we have to ask those people who what? Who call to reform. And with that, brothers and sisters, we bring our lecture to a close. And if there are any questions, comments, or critiques, فَتَفَضَّلُوا بِهَا. Any questions, comments, any critiques? تفضل شيخ.
I know when my kids was my youngest daughter was in the 12th grade. It was a requirement for them to take this class, and it was called the Theory of Knowledge. And basically the premise was everything is a theory. There's nothing absolute.
Okay.
And I know my initial gut feeling about that was there is something very cynical in that. At the end of
Sinister,
that,
not just cynical.
Yeah.
Sinister.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
At the end of that, it was now I'm a Muslim, and there's no absolute. Question now.
Everything.
Everything.
Question everything.
And I didn't. And then I mean my over the long period after the school, I see now in the thinking, my daughter's thinking now, and I can see how so many things that she thinks now is related to that. Like for instance, like I remember one time I went to a brother's house. I met just meeting for the first time, and immediately when he opened the door, a big dog came to the door, and I was backing up, and so the guy came to me. He said, "What's the problem? You don't like dogs?" I said, in our religion, we don't have dogs as pets in our house. So he said, you know what he told me?
What's that?
He said, your problem is you need to get rid of the hadith. That's the problem. So it's the same kind of thing here.
Right.
And now, so now, my daughter sometimes will say, well, you know, I'll go to the house and the dog is there, but that's their dog. You know, little things that you don't see as problematic until you start looking at the whole thing.
Subhanallah. Allah is khair. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Anyone else like to share or provide?
Just, you know, one thing you just
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh.
talking about it, like, you know, the upcoming generations. We feel that some of the Muslims, you know, I'm talking to, they tell me that, you know, I don't want to have any kids. Because, you know, what I'm going to introduce my kids to, you know, it scares me.
Scared, yeah.
So, how can we assure them that, you know, inshallah, you know, by doing good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide for us in the future.
Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in two places in the Quran, once in Surah Al-An'am and once in Surah Al-Isra, He tells us, so He says, for example, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةَ الْإِمْلَاقِ, right? So He tells us, don't kill your children, don't take their lives out of fear of poverty, fear that you won't be able to fend for them or they won't be able to fend for themselves. And I think this is similar. Don't not have children because you fear that they will go astray. You fear that you won't be able to protect them, etc. We have to understand that at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to have children. And He wants us to do our due diligence as parents in guiding those children. As the Prophet said in the hadith of Abdullah ibn Umar, he said, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْعُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. He said, all of you are shepherds and each one of you is going to be asked about his flock. Do your due diligence. Raise your kids. And so we have to be up to that challenge because we need to raise the next Umar, the next Abu Bakr. And if not me or you or the brother, then who? You see that? If we all take that attitude, rather than Islam growing and the next Umar being born and things changing for the better, Muslims will continue to be at a disadvantage. And so it's important for us, yes, to have kids, to trust in Allah, but also to do our due diligence and our part in raising them to be good Muslims. And a lot of times it's a community effort. It's very important for the communities to see our youth and our kids as the future, as a tremendously important asset that has to be protected and preserved, and to work together because it is difficult in a society as a parent alone to succeed. You do need the help. You need the help of your community. You do need Islamic schools. You need good after-school programs. You need masajid which offer programs and services which draw the youth to the masjid and also teach them and educate them, and not just teaching them, for example, doing like, for example, tahfidh al-Quran programs, but teaching them how to think critically and how to challenge some of the things that they're being bombarded with in school, right? How to challenge those things and be confident believers at a very young age. We can do it, but there's some heavy lifting there, but it can be done. Yeah, but we can do it. We can do it if we put our minds to it, if it's important enough to us. Yeah. Like any other questions or comments about 5 minutes before we offer Salat al-Isha? Any questions, comments? Going once?
Okay.
I
have another.
Sure.
Okay, if anybody else raising hand?
No, I didn't see anybody else.
Okay, yeah, I teach in our Sunday Islamic school here.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah.
And sometimes, I ask the kids, every time I give them a class, I ask them the first question is, did you make Fajr today?
MashaAllah.
Sometimes I get some feedback from parents. And parents are very upset that I'm asking this question. Yeah. So I tell them, the Muslims, the first thing that connects us to Islam, of course, would be the Salah.
The prayer, yeah.
Yeah, we might not be doing, lots of Islam, but at least, this is the minimum requirement. But two parents, they told me that, this is a very rude question, to ask my son or my daughter. Yeah. So, I'm trying to tell them, there's a minimum we have to go by.
Yes.
But of course, they don't accept it. I don't want my son, to be asking, I don't want my daughter to be asking. So what should I do, about, this kind of thing?
What I would say is two things. One is ad-din nasiha. Religion is being sincere and advising sincerely. And I think that your intention is to advise the kids and to encourage them to pray. I'm sure that's your intention. I think it's important. So there's two sides to this. I think it's important for the parents to realize this is your intention. You're just trying to encourage their kids. You're trying to motivate their kids. You're trying to inspire their kids. And I think that they should, appreciate that. But they may not appreciate the method. Sometimes the method may not be approved. And they may have a point. So maybe you adjust the way you encourage them. And you say, for example, it's important to pray Fajr. I hope we're all praying Fajr. And if we're not praying Fajr or we didn't pray Fajr, we should pray Fajr now, right? We should make it up. Or you could say...
That's what I usually do. I tell them, okay, take 5 minutes, go,
exactly.
Make wudu,
but instead of saying, like, putting them on the spot and saying, hey, did you pray Fajr? You might say, for example, I hope you prayed Fajr. If you didn't pray Fajr, we should make sure that we make up Fajr. And so nobody feels called out, but you gave the reminder. You didn't, it was just a general thing. It's there for whoever wants to take advantage of it. And so maybe that might be a way that the parents will feel a little bit more accepting of the advice because you didn't call out the child. But at the same time, you did what our religion tells us to do, to advise. I do want to make sure that we let the sisters know that if they have a question, they can ask us.
Of course.
So when I say, does anybody have a question, I'm certainly speaking to the sisters as well. So is there a sister who has a question or a comment or a concern or a critique? Is there?
We're just saying, Jazakallah khair, very good presentation and a way to make us think.
Barakallahu feekum, alhamdulillah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. We're going to close with the brother then.
Actually, now, because I'm really to reform how Muslims are behaving, it's not reforming Islam, reforming the behavior of Muslims. Take, for example, what's happened in Afghanistan. Now, the way they are treating the women and preventing the children and daughters to learn, this is not Islam. So this is the point that sometimes the reform requirements are for reform our understanding and proper application of Islam. Not Islam is not the problem with Islam itself, but the problem that the way that people understand it and apply it.
Okay. Point well taken. That there may be some people who use the word reform and what they intend by it is what you said. That there are some people who they're misinformed or they're ill-informed. Or they misapply certain Islamic teachings, and so they want to reform the way that they apply it. But I don't think that we can say that's true for all of them. And we gave an example of someone who says, no, we need to change some Islamic things. And so these are the people that, or basically what we talked about here was that we're going to hear these calls. When we hear these calls, there are certain questions we need to be asking. And we need to determine, one of the questions is, well, what do you mean by that? And we can judge the call by the response that we get from what they mean by it. If they mean what you said, then yeah, we can accept that. And we talked about that. We asked them, well, what do you mean by that? Because there's some intended means of reform that we can accept and some that we have to what? We have to reject. We did say that toward the beginning. And so if they mean by what you said, then yeah, we can discuss that. We can welcome that. We have to get specific, but we can welcome it on its face. But we know that they don't all mean that. And many of them mean reform, meaning change, uproot, do away with. And we gave the example of someone who called something from the religion of Allah bizarre, problematic, in need of being modernized and updated. That person doesn't mean we need to change the way Muslims are behaving who are misinformed. He's saying, no, these things are from the deen and they need to be done away with. And that's the problem. That's what we're saying. That's why we're saying, when people say reform, it's a word that's ambiguous. It could be interpreted in different ways. It could be intended in different ways. We have to know, what do people mean by that? And people can't say that reform and tajdeed are the same thing. They're not. They are not the same thing. And so they can't quote the hadith of Dawood and say, yeah, we can reform the religion. See, because the Prophet said, ala ra'si kulli miyati sana. Okay? That Allah is going to give someone or send someone who will renew or revive the religion so we can reform. Reform is one thing, renew is something else. What do you mean by reform? Depending on what you mean by it, we're either going to accept it or reject it. And with that, brothers and sisters, we bring today's session to a close. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you all for listening so attentively. Thank you all, those of you who offered your comments and questions. I think they enriched the discussion. This is not a discussion that can be had in one night. It's a discussion I encourage you as a community to continue to what? To have. Because it might not be as important for you, but it's definitely important for you. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.